Sindhoor, I think, when some of the discussions that we had as part of the Bark series in Dog Centre Care and some of the presentations by yourself and your wonderful students, and Sarabi and Anushri and Eva and Sajanya, we're looking at really tricky, challenging presentations where this is picking up on Amber's point, really, where, God forbid, that the animals, the dogs were allowed to behave and to express to us their needs for safety and what that safety looked like, in a way that we're still able to be structurally safe. I think this is the key. Obviously, when we have to make mitigations for that, of course, and how powerful those responses were, because of course those dogs then, they're doing things that is what you just talked about there, Sarah. All those different components meant they could regulate better. They could feel heard. They felt they had a voice. All the pressures that come off this stuff, rather than being pushed into some kind of, that square peg through a round hole thing.
Yeah. I think it's fundamentally the problem is in that we're very quick to, I mean, it's not just enough for us to label things, it's also important for us to categorize these labels, and we want to see them in nice neat buckets. And again, a cultural baggage that we carry is that we have this good versus bad, right versus wrong, the great evil and the the great good kind of a thing. And if we are willing to kind of ask those difficult questions, look past it, look at things a little differently, and say, at the end of the day, the notion of a right and a wrong is really a very human moral construct that, and again, it's not based in fact, it's just an ideological thing. So can we park that aside and look at things a little bit more deeply, a little bit more meaningfully? And then many cases have been presented here. A lot of other answers start you know presenting themselves. A lot of other challenges start presenting themselves. They could be physical challenges that the dog is facing, they could be emotional challenges, they could be relationship, based on relationship. Um, and 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 sadly, we have had so much focus on just looking at a behavior, labeling it as desirable or undesirable, put it in this bucket or that, and just modify. And all of this other conversation has gotten lost. We've really not had them. And it's very sad for me when I hear somebody say, hey, this is a problem with a relationship, you need to do relationship building. Somebody actually turns around and says, how do I do that? What are the steps to do it? And that is such a telling commentary on who we have turned into society, that you need steps, you need a step by step guide on how to express love, how to build trust, how to gain trust, how to give trust. It's ridiculous that we need to have a lecture for me to convince somebody that if you want to gain trust, you need to give trust. And so, if you want to gain the trust of your dog, you need to know how to trust your dog. And where does that happen? If you're sitting on a pedestal, again, a culturally described pedestal where you're sitting right on top and the dog is sitting somewhere below, where are you going to find the courage to actually trust? You're not going to trust somebody who's so inferior to you. And so, this requires you to really look at things very differently. But for me, the hope continues to remain that if we are willing to do this work, if you're willing to park aside the labels, and we've started doing this with human beings, we've started doing this with children, but we really need to do it at a larger scale, is when we look at so-called bad behavior, really look beneath that. What else is going on? What are they struggling with? And how, as we, somebody who is connected to them, somebody who's part of a relationship with them, whatever the distance may be, what is my role in setting right the evils of the world to make it a little easier for you? How do I clear the path up a little bit for you? And we can do that at many, many levels. And with dogs, particularly because they live with us and they're so dependent on us, we can do this in a very powerful way for them. But and it's really endless, it's limitless of how much we can do in terms of you know paving the path, making the path a little easier for them to be able to walk a little easier, for them to be able to express a little better and start feeling a little safer. and and the amount that we can draw from it in terms of understanding our own relationships, having that reflexivity to understand how we navigate our own relationship spaces. So this question, right, and this comes up all the time. Oh, so if we're going to be not controlling them, where are boundaries? When did this happen that, we've decided that boundaries and control are synonymous? Many of us here have probably been not women who have been easy to control, right? And we've like, but that does not mean we don't understand boundaries. That doesn't mean that boundaries are established and maintained only through control, and that that individuals who do not are not being controlled, who are given more agency, will violate boundaries willy-nilly. That's not the case with human beings. There's no reason to assume that with dogs. And if we haven't really expressed this idea of having boundaries, having negotiations, having relationships without control, then we're really missing out on something. So to me, the call to the future is to say, can we explore these aspects with our relationship with animals so that it makes our own relationships richer, and there's less stress for us to confirm to good or bad, and there's more support when we are being at our bad worst. you know there is more compassion with which others come to us, and can working with dogs be kind of the ambassadors for that way of looking at things?
Well, that's really powerful, and especially this notion of trust, Sindhoor. It's quite mind-blowing when you think about it. I want to build trust with my dog. Well, we need to trust them to behave them, as in for them to behave how they need to and show us things and have that trust in them. And this notion, this brings us back to the point that we made earlier. I think that somehow we've decided that if we don't teach kids loads of stuff, if we don't teach dogs loads of stuff, we'll just have loads of feral kids and loads of feral dogs, without actually thinking that they might have something to teach us actually about how they do. Maybe Mother Nature knows some stuff about this stuff, and maybe she knows about developmental stuff and what the brain can do and what they can do with the world. So you've added a whole new component to this notion of trust here. And also this notion on the boundaries, as you say, that kind of connection to control. Um, uh, uh, it's a lot to think about and a lot to unpack, I think, because again, we're thinking about our own experiences here and our own conditioning with this stuff. But this is another beautiful thing about these discussions. They can free us all from many chains, actually, to the past, not just how we've trained dogs traditionally. I think there's more richness. Maia.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the thread, Sindhoor, that you brought up, and then also pulling it all the way back to what you said, Laura, earlier about a hierarchy or a chain of being, because it seems to me like they go together, and that with that chain of being, the reason humans end up on top is because of a purported relationship to our world, and that is one of autonomy, of rational control, right? So sometimes I think we limit what we can do with our dogs because we see, oh, here's this power differential. We are autonomous, our dogs are dependent. How do we give them more autonomy? Because obviously autonomy is what anyone would want. That's the height of existence and self-realization. But there are other ethical traditions that privilege dependency and care and interrelatedness, and that don't see a relationship of dependency as an inferior relationship that needs a crutch on top of it. It will never be as good as if the dog could be autonomous, but we can give him as much autonomy as possible. And I'm thinking a lot more deeply about what those traditions could give to our relationships with our dogs. If we stopped conceiving of this as a relationship that needs a Band-Aid because of this power differential, and thought more about what we might do where this relationship is perfect as is, but needs a different ethical framework than this very Western, traditional, autonomous, rational framework that goes on top of it. And to that, I think, of course, there's the power differential. We cannot forget that. I live in a place now, I grew up with free roaming dogs, but including some dogs that were associated with a household. Like we had a dog, but there were many dogs that weren't associated with any, and they all mingled. My dogs now have to ask me to go to the bathroom. So I don't mean to say that there are not power differentials, but I'm not sure that the answer is more autonomy. I think it might be more interconnectedness. It might be more of a back and forth. When you talk about how do you build a relationship, I mean, my dogs watch me all the time. They know everything about me. They don't need instruction on that, but I do, because I hold the power. So I have the luxury of ignoring where they don't. So to me, I'm wondering a little bit more about whether a future ethical framework might look a little less like an inverted traditional framework and a little more like something different, entirely different than that framework.
I love that, because this is the beautiful thing about asking different questions and not necessarily roping ourselves into something. It's looking at the huge, beautiful possibilities of thinking differently and asking different questions. And I think you're right. And remember, our relationships, this is the thing that Victoria's done with looking at the harmony model, of course, is recognizing I have a different relationship with my husband and my dogs and different people. We have that, and there's an element of negotiated safety in that sometimes when we're in that position to be able to be that. And I think this comes back to some of the things we talked about earlier about being better at observing the experience of another, being more available to it, bypassing some of our own biases in that process, but also waiting for that feedback, Maia, about what that relationship starts to look like then. And I think it's that bit that is important, I think, really, because even through positive training, when we've had a very task-oriented approach where, I'm going to use because I know about reinforcement schedules, I know about the power of different reinforcers. Where's the opportunity for the dog to tell us anything then if we're just modeling things all the time? So I think this is really important. I love that. I think that's really important. And on a bigger level, thinking about what this future might look like, but also on an individual level, inviting caregivers to really embrace the quality of the presence they have with their dogs. I think it's a beautiful thing. And it's amazing. All of us work with the public. We almost have to give the public permission to do that sometimes. But guess what? You don't have to do that, or you don't have to go there, or that doesn't matter so much. And they're like, oh God, yeah, well, I thought I did because I had to get compliance from my dog or whatever's happened. It's a relatively new phenomenon, right? The last
Well,
20
can I just interrupt there, Andrew? Because I do think social media has a lot to do with it.
Mm.
And I do think it's been it's incredibly seductive. And people are getting all kinds of information from all kinds of different people with all kinds of different ways of doing things. And so that becomes overwhelming. And sometimes if somebody sees somebody doing something, however abusive it might seem to one person, the other person will celebrate it. So I do think social media, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I do think social media has caused this, or has exacerbated it.
Exacerbated it. And I think it is a relatively new phenomenon. I grew up in the 70s. We had Barbara Woodhouse on the telly back in the day, as we know. But that was about it. And actually for us as a family, we didn't particularly do a lot of training, actually. We just were. I'm not saying welfare was any better or worse back then, but I think there was more of a notion of you just be. But then there was this big push onwards from there about the importance of that kind of having that compliance and the obedience and that kind of thing. And I think, and that's the bit we've got to leave behind a bit now. It's about freeing the general public to enjoy their dogs more and a relationship they know is already there. Most of our clients are stuck in task when we meet them because they think I've got to get this task done, but actually they do care, and they care on many levels, and they understand actually, well, my dog's different at home, but they're different when they're out. So maybe there's something different there. It's not them necessarily behaving badly, which is sadly the name of a show that we have over here, which doesn't help either. Suzanne, I think this comes into, you wanted to kind of jump in there, but I was going to say this comes back to this relational thing again.
It does come back to relationship. And I remind trainers that work with me to ask this question, which comes from a little book that I bought the rights to and published, Separate Lifetimes. How many dogs old are you? Because it all sounds very good at this level of we should all understand this and we should all do this. If you've only had one dog, to say like, why do we need to be taught about relationships? If you were on your first or second human relationship, you would need to know a lot, because this is what we do as parents in theory, right? When Mary did that and you said that and this happened, this is why. So we've been educated more or less, in human relationships a long time. But most of the clients I work with, if they're older, maybe they've had 4 or 5 dogs, period. How many dogs old are you? So there is a huge need to actually learn what that means. The same way, if this is the first, Mongolian sheep herder family that I've worked with, probably someone should educate me about what's appropriate. What does that mean? It's not threatening, it's an honor. Oh, so the sheep eyeball is an honor. Wonderful. Didn't see it that way myself. But there's this notion also that worries me, that if we just understand the animal, that we can help this healing. Healing's a very potent word because it already includes this notion of health, that we are going to move this animal to physical, mental, or emotional health. And first and foremost, my start is, where are you at as a being? How functional are you? Because not everything that's broken can be fixed. But this gets glided over so that you have clients who, despite the fact they've got a dog, say here in the States, a coonhound Catahoula cross, now gets moved up to the suburbs of Connecticut. This is not a dog who's well suited to that lifestyle. And so they're trying to do well. They're trying to get it right. They're trying to be positive. They're trying to be humane. And what they have is a massive project dog that really should be living perhaps in a sanctuary, which would be the most supportive of that animal. When we talk about healing, sometimes the situations we put the animals in, they're never going to heal to the point where they're like, oh, yes, now I can handle suburban life. Thanks. Not at all. These dogs would think, if you just give me a 25-acre preserve, drop off some food and water, a couple more dogs, some bunnies, I'm good. And so there's this notion that defeats a lot of the clients that end up in my door, because they have done everything that social media and all the books tell them to do. And no one has said to them, the animal you're working with is not a healthy, functional being. This animal's really struggling with daily life. I worked with one little dog, and in the seminar setting, I don't know why she thought this dog was suitable. She hadn't given me enough information, but I looked at the dog and I said, where do you live? And she said, about half an hour, 45 minutes away. I said, then call your husband to come get this dog. Like, this is not humane to have this dog here. So while the dog was there, I just used the dog as an example, and someone just like clicked a pen and the dog just did this. And I said, compare for us how the dog is here versus how she is at home. Because sometimes if you could be a fly on the wall, dogs really very happy in their home environment. They're like, oh, as Sarah said, for people to be able to see, this is the dog I live with, not you're only seeing the dog, doing that. And so she said, oh, she's always like that. The refrigerator motor goes off and she does that. And I said, how long have you had her? And she said, 5 years. And I said, you understand, when you come home and you close your front door and you latch the bolt, you are safe. This dog for 5 years, 24/7, has never been safe. And so she's like, well, what do I need to do to help with that? And it's like, you live in an apartment building, in a condo in a suburban neighborhood. This environment will never be okay for this animal. It's just like saying, I'm going to break your leg and then I'm going to let it heal. And then I'm going to keep breaking another bone. Like, we're missing that piece. And I think it's a very dangerous piece where we do not discuss how functional is this being? What does healing actually look like? Not everything that's broken can be fixed. And I think it's woven through there that as long as we are just positive enough or empathetic enough or we're listening enough, we can find a point for that animal to be healthy. And my experience with the animal says that is not true.
The challenges within the rescue world have made it that, certainly around here, dogs that do not feel safe and are not, this is a weird word to use, that should never be adopted out, because they cannot cope, rescues are still doing that because putting them into a home, regardless of what this dog is experiencing, comes above everything else that could happen to that dog. And that I think is also a tragedy.
You know, life at all costs. And I'm,
Yeah.
you know, what I would love to see in the future, I would love to see more sanctuaries, truly, where dogs could just be dogs and not asked to deal with humans or human life, because there are some dogs who would happily sign them up. There's a social media page and it's devoted to wild horses with a very wealthy woman who has a lot of land devoted to these horses. And they're in huge tracts, but there are times when they adopt them and it's like, nope, they will go return them to the wild, because even in that setting with that much freedom and autonomy, these horses are like, I would rather kill myself going over that fence than be here. And so I think being able to assess how functional is as a being is missing. We're not looking at that as a telltale where we would do that. I mean, the joke in one of my seminars is, you know, is now a good time? Is this really a good way to assess functionality? And I have a woman with a clipboard looking all businessy, and I said, well, you know, Bob's interview for the job was really rather, you know, unsatisfactory. And then the next shot is Bob is in a coma in a hospital with, like, you know, all of his limbs broken. It's like, yes, he's not suitable for this job, but as long as we love them and give them everything, that's okay. But I think that's woven through this, and we have to be careful that there has to be a notion of what constitutes health and healing. In human work, I mean, you know, how functional and comfortable and safe can I get you? And the answer is not always, oh, well, thanks, now I'm totally functional. There was a really great story from the head psychiatrist of the New York prison system, and he was talking about someone who had just done just horrible, horrible murders. I mean, this is a truly a menace of a human. But after years and years in jail, he formed a relationship with the developmentally challenged inmate who came in that they thought, like, maybe he's going to kill him. He didn't. He actually took him under his wing. And they were like, huh, we didn't think he'd be able to form a relationship. And what do you think? You know, would you be able to, if you were let out on parole, would you be able to make that transition? And the guy said, no, I am only okay because of the rules and the limits and everything that happens here, this environment, I can not kill. But I guarantee you, if you put me on parole, as soon as I'm out, I'm going to do it again. And so that was a very sobering thought, that, you know, where is that environment that allows for the best functioning possible? This is never going to be a human that should be wandering around in human society. And there are dogs like that. They could belong to someone on a desert island who just has dogs. But where is that magical island? Yeah.
I'm so glad you brought this up, Suzanne, because I think this again shows why these discussions are so important about how we look at things moving forwards. Because this notion of trying to fix, this notion of being broken based on other people's versions of normal, recognizing what that healing might look like, recognizing what might even be possible. I'm talking at Daniel Shaw's conference in November, and my talk's called Devil, Dogs and Monsters. Just how we look at stuff, you know, this notion that that's a devil dog and that's a monster because of what they've done as a human, and recognizing how we have to understand more about the individual stories to think about the future, not necessarily to rehab that person or that dog. And actually, this is again the smoke and mirrors, because, oh yeah, actually, this is all, you know, this kind of notion that, you know, only certain techniques can work on these dogs to save them. By just pushing their behaviors deeper down, actually makes them more dangerous potentially. I think that's the key that we have to recognize here, and because that's what's happening. It's like, you know what, if we can't understand your story fully, we're just going to make sure that we, I don't know, for want of other example, zap you until you comply. And also, by the way, that isn't saving anything, because even if that animal was to not be that anymore, they're living a life of sufferance through the fear of what comes next. So that's not saving anything, really. I think that's the thing. Laura, this is very much your bag, of course. So we're getting very much into Laura's territory here as well. I think thinking about what it is to think about the individual's need to feel safe and where that journey can be, and how that relationship changed. This notion of befriending, of course, that you talk about. And I think this is something that we have to consider our side of things as well. That kind of movement through awareness, acknowledgement, and acceptance of the kind of charge that we have to care for another.
And I probably need to preface that, because befriending is, I think, the ethic of the future. I'd like to, I mean, without being too hubristic or too expansive with humans and dogs. And it is, especially since we've been talking about healing, to me, it is the magic sauce of healing. It's when we can accept all the parts of ourselves, even the parts we don't like, and say, make peace with it, make an ally of, for example, our autonomic nervous system, because in traditional approaches to dogs, the autonomic nervous system, the amygdala, the hippocampus, that arousal system, hyperarousal, has been seen as the enemy, right? We have to suppress that. We have to get rid of it. We have to modify it. So yes, and I think it would be very interesting to ask people, especially in this group, what is the language that we no longer use? What is the language we feel like we can no longer use to describe our relationships with other humans, with dogs? And for me, well, behavior modification would be a big one. I would just like to delete that from the vocabulary. The other big one, and I think this really pertains to what people have been talking about, would be impulse control. Impulse control. No, I joke with clients, to me, impulse control sounds like juvenile detention. No, that's not what we're doing. And it's really misleading anyway, if you look at the neuroscience of it. But I don't talk about impulse control anymore. I talk about self-regulation. Self-regulation, having, the toolbox, if you're a dog or a human, to navigate situations reasonably well. And how do we get that toolbox? Well, I think this has been a fundamental misunderstanding. Traditional dog training has said we get impulse control by telling the dog what to do, referring to our laundry list of the well-behaved dog. And usually, as everyone is so eloquently articulated, that means doing things that are just downright unnatural for dogs, whether it's body positions or, Suzanne has her example of this dog at her webinar. I routinely, because I live in a university town, I'm retired from Cornell University, and I routinely get contacts by university students. Well, I just adopted a Great Pyrenees and we're living in the dorm. And I'm having so much trouble. And when I go to class, my dog is in the crate 8 hours a day. Can you fix this? That would be the impulse control. Just say no. You got to move. You can't. There's no way to fix it within these parameters, but I would like to shift things, and this is just one way of doing it. It's not the only way. By no longer talking about behavior modification, no longer talking about impulse control, but talking about self-regulation. And how do we learn how to self-regulate? It's through co-regulation. It's through relationships with our parents, with our caregivers, when we're very early, probably can't even remember it, right? It's those times when we really cannot regulate for ourselves, and we depend on other people to help us learn how to do that. That is what I see the kind of interspecies interaction, cooperation component of the dog-human relationship. It's something that we have to facilitate in dogs. We can't impose it on them. And it comes from what we do, even our tone of voice when we talk to dogs. I do a lot on the prosody of safety, the tone, because we all know tone is as or even more important than what we're actually saying a lot of times. And so, and we also know now that the brain processes tone a lot faster than it figures out what you're actually saying. And I've had many people say, well, I was just told to talk to dogs in a gruff, authoritative tone, not to mention, you know, more harsh, sit down. So I think the model I want to move to is a fundamentally interactive, co-regulative one. And out of that, both humans and dogs learn to self-regulate. And that is a hard one for humans. Right. And one example is I've just started working with it's a livestock guarding dog who's been biting people, and one of the persons in the family has a lot of issues with self-regulation. And the last time he or she, sorry, the last time they actually were bitten, it's because they stepped on the dog getting dressed for work. They stepped on the dog bit them, and this person had a very knee-jerk reaction and actually punched the dog in the head. Now, I guess, I mean, I did imply if I hear you punching the dog again, I'm going to report you to animal control. But I think the much bigger issue is that in order for this dog to heal, the human who punched him is going to have to do some healing of their own. They're going to have to learn self-regulation, right? And I'm not a licensed mental health professional, but I can certainly help. And the relationship with the dog can help this human learn what co-regulation means, because it works both ways. It's not just us humans providing a model for the dogs, it's dogs providing a model for us humans. But I'll stop there, but I think it's really important. We need to develop new words, new models to lead us into a future, even if they're going to change over time. I'm very blueprint aversive, and I think that's a good thing.
I think this is the beautiful thing about that shift from task to care for me, because the trouble with task is as a primary focus. If tasks can't be completed, everybody's kind of touched on this. You were talking about this as well, Suzanne. I think about the unrealistic expectations have with some dogs. If the task can't be completed, somebody's to blame, right? The dog's not good enough, caregiver's not doing it right, and even the dog trainer who's even instigating the task now feels they can't do their job well. The problem wasn't any of those three entities. The problem was the task that was unattainable and unachievable. So I think the good thing about care, which is about learning from the other first and taking in all these things we're talking about, is that it gives us chance to kind of give ourselves grace in that process. But it does work both ends of the lead, so to speak. Sindhoor talks about this a lot with the on the bark side of things as well, about how much we are able to get that kind of instructional support through that co-regulation from the dogs as well. I've shared this before, but I worked with a guy going back along who used to hit his dog with the end of the lead when the dog barks at the dogs. He hit the dog quite hard with the end of the lead. And we went through this process together, went on this journey together, a non-judgmental, supportive process. And he was able to say to me, as part of his own healing, I understand now that I was hitting that dog because I was angry and embarrassed. That was a huge thing for him to come to. And it meant that he was not going to do that again now because of his own level of awareness. And I think a lot of this stuff is our supportive awareness. Thank you, Laura. I think all this stuff is really important. Amber, yeah, sorry, Amber, you wanted to come in there. I've got a question I was going to ask you. I'll just let you say your thing, I think.
Well, I don't know what to say, really. I just want to pick up a couple of points, really, that have been raised and go back a little bit, just a moment to Suzanne, something you were saying about the individuals perhaps not being in a situation. So you've got a dog, and it could be a human too, of course, could be all sorts of animals, but it could be a dog who, because of their development, because of their life experiences, which has happened on top of their genetics, let's not get that too, but that whole thing which is wrapped up, and it's not a thing, the living being that is wrapped up as that dog, may be in a position, and it ties in with what Laura was just saying, where they are, they're different, okay? Every individual is different, and maybe they are not in a situation where they are able at the moment, possibly forever, to develop certain strategies and life skills that might make them be able to cope or survive, certainly perhaps not to thrive in a particular environmental setting. Yeah. And we see that. And first thing I just wanted to say was, from a shelter working perspective, that clearly in a shelter environment, almost no one's going to be able to make that assessment. We all know that. And so there's no negative towards any shelter workers. I know from anybody in the panel where we might place a dog in a home, hoping the dog might have the ability to develop that skill set, or you know, whatever it might well be, because we don't know sometimes until we try. You know, I have dogs, I have an indoor enrichment room nowadays, and I have dogs who come to visit for consultations or just for visits. And, you know, I know that there are people that I work with who go, oh, I'm really not sure if that dog's going to be okay in that environment. Is it going to be overwhelming for that dog? I have, you know, clinical behaviorists who might go, oh, I'm not sure actually if you should see the dog there, because maybe it might be too much, you know, but we don't know until we try. We don't know, and we can use the information available to us about that dog. We might say, actually, the dog seems to be, you know, going back to what Sarah was saying, you know, really easily stimulated visually, or easily stimulated from a sound perspective, whatever it might be. So we might really bring those specific external stimuli really minimally within that environment, so that we're definitely not intentionally overloading the dog. But sometimes we don't know until we put a dog into an environment. We might have some ideas, but we don't know. So, you know, there's, you know, and then we might get there and we might go, actually, this for whatever reason, this isn't going to work for this individual. Now we've seen them in that environment, and we've given them a little bit of time. Yeah. But there are individuals who perhaps, because of their life experience on top of their genetics, are going to really struggle to develop what we might call, currently in science, we might refer to it as executive functions. And this is, Laura was talking about impulse control. So, you know, from a behavior neurophysiological science perspective, my understanding at least is that we tend to talk about impulse control as being one component of what we refer to as executive functions. executive functions being, you know, the way that the brain works in a cognitive manner in order to amend and edit and help us cope with the environment which we're in and respond to the environment which we're in a way that is positive for ourselves. And so that, you know, executive functions include some amounts of behavioral inhibition is what we actually call it scientifically, but I agree with Laura that these things aren't always the right words. And part of behavioral inhibition will be impulse control, as an example. Big parts of executive functions as well are working memory, which is our capacity to amend what, you know, sort of assess and amend what's going on with us and then learn from that, and cognitive flexibility. And so from an executive function perspective, we may well have individuals who, because of their development, plus minus their genes as well, are not able to cope in a wide variety of situations, and they might not ever be able to learn to adapt. I prefer the word adapt to heal, because for me personally, it's a bit triggering. I find the word healing suggests that you're broken, and I'm not a big fan of thinking of individuals as broken. They're just, we're not all the same when, you know, and that's just how we are, but that's just a personal thing for me. And so my question about all of, when I think about all that, because we almost paint a picture that if an individual needs more almost boundaries because they can't develop themselves to be able to, you know, gain agency, autonomy, and feel comfortable with that, you know, then we're back where we should be in terms of behavioral control, aren't we? We should be actually putting more rules, more boundaries in place for this individual who's really struggling, you know. Now, nobody here is thinking that particular situation, but I can imagine people who are listening might start thinking that, well, actually there's a, you know, and what do we do for those individuals who are put in, they're a round peg in a square hole? Yeah, and actually it's not always possible to take them out of that hole, because whatever hole we now put them into is going to be, in the human orientated world, it is going to be very, very similar. Now, of course, in my profession, what happens an awful lot is just use drugs, you know, and I say my profession, and I'm going to caveat that by saying that's the medical profession. Let's use drugs to help that individual fit better into that hole. And, you know, and that's not a negative, because sometimes drugs can help with that to some degree, but it's not normally, you know, a method of really getting true neurophysiological internal change, which is going to allow that individual to thrive in the environment in many circumstances. It might in some, but it, you know, for many, it's more just another layer of kind of potential coping, realistically. So my question out of all of that really is, where do we get it so wrong? You know, where are we getting it so wrong with dogs, from the perspective that we end up with individuals who are not able to develop relationships effectively, get that social buffering effect, be able to thrive, develop great executive functions, to have all these wonderful things that we're talking about here. And for me, that's a big thing that I would really, going forward with a hope in training, that we just keep reconsidering, is what developmental opportunities do we offer dogs when they're young and throughout their lifetime? Because it's not just a juvenile thing. I mean, I have a juvenile course and we explore the whole concept of what happens inside mum, and then, you know, early in what we call the postnatal period, when you're a young puppy, then you go through adolescence. We know there's huge amounts of change happening in brain and body during that time. And it's not like then there is this shut off, you know, when you suddenly become an adult, because I don't know about you, and I'm not going to say how old I am, but old enough as an adult to know that I'm still learning and changing and adapting. Yeah. And so it is a lifetime's opportunity, but clearly there are developmental windows, you know, early in the dog's life, certainly through adolescence as well, where they are, you know, they have a greater opportunity for developmental change at that time. So that's something that I just feel we need to keep asking ourselves as a pet creating environment, because actually that's what we're doing. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, just saying that's often what we're doing. We're getting dogs to benefit ourselves, and many of us hopefully maybe think that we're doing it for the dog's benefit too as well. But, you know, when we're doing that and we're creating that relationship between humans and dogs, how are we going about that? And why are we not getting into situations where we're able to get, you know, help individuals be in a position of really good overall development, you know? And going forward in terms of welfare and training, that for me is a huge question still. You know, what is this population that we are creating? And I don't like that fact, you know, but we breed and we create, you know, and we raise and we train. We've got to keep you've got to keep asking ourselves about that entire process and thinking, what is that actually doing for the dog? You know, what skill set is it giving, and how are we providing opportunity for development, you know, to make them, to not make them, but help them become the round peg in the round hole across their lifetime.
Well, you answered the question I was going to ask you, and also you've shared, which is what I want to ask everybody now as we kind of wrap things up, because you've really helped put things into focus there, Amber, because guess what? A lot of this stuff is complicated. And we have to recognize that, and some of the kind of experiences that some of these dogs have, they're complicated, and even trying to work out the experience of a human loved one can be complicated, and they can talk to us. But this notion here about, I think this whole thing about this future vision, there are two areas for me that are really important about why we need to have this discussion, and we have to keep evolving. One is, what do we do in that first 12 months? What's our priorities now for these dogs? Where are we getting it wrong? Where have we got it wrong regarding that individual dog and their ability, like Laura was saying, to learn to self-regulate? You know, to self-regulate is something we have to learn. It's not an innate thing. We're gifted. We have to learn it. And that's often based on the quality of that co-regulation and those secure attachments as social species, all this kind of thing. And also those dogs who have those specific, very challenging behaviors, when those behaviors are the communication of that dog trying to sort something out physically, emotionally, socially. So actually, that's why we have to move on. It's not enough just to make it look really simple, which is, well, just make the dog behave, right? That's how we've been in the past. If the dog behaves, then everything's okay. And I think many dogs muddle through this, right? Because they're amazing. Most of us muddled through it. You know, it wasn't ideal, a lot of our situations, but we've kind of muddled through. But there's many dogs and many humans are being deeply let down by not feeling heard, not feeling safe, and these kind of things. What I want to put round to people, and I think that this is part of the reason why we've had this discussion today. What I want to do is, we've had a couple of hours here, so it's great. And all the people listening in, I'm going to put this on YouTube as individual little episodes, breaking it up into little chunks, so you can catch it up in a more kind of easily accessible form. But all those people who have stuck with us, you know, the viewing figures have stayed pretty constant the whole way through. So I really appreciate you sticking with us. But it's been absolute gold today. And I think anybody hearing these conversations can just see how the status quo isn't good enough now for the dogs, or for caregivers, actually. So what I would like to invite people to say, as we kind of close up, really is, what is this positive vision then for you? What is your hope? What is it your hope that people... I'm looking at some of the stuff in the chat. This is really resonating with our colleagues, many of which, as I say, have felt quite weary with recent discussions. It's making them realize, actually, I'm part of a movement that is shifting away from some of those old discussions. That's the past.